Hey up everyone. Well, while we're still bombarded every day by a marketing storm of new KTM models for 2025 and now talk of a brand new KTM 690 Rally, all is not as it seems at KTM. And after the furore of opening the factory in March, production has been stopped again. CF Moto have announced KTM dealers will not be distributing their bikes, and the workers in Austria are back to being paid for just 30 hours a week by the Austrian government. This was a video about all that had happened after the last extraordinary shareholders meeting. But the day before today's EGM, major announcements were made again. So I will start by looking at them and then talk you through the lead up to what I think is the final death knell for a company who should in reality not be in the position they are now. In the Austrian publication Die Presse, we got the headline, KTM stops production again and production will not resume until the end of July. GP1 added that only 4,200 units had been made during the restart, and then Rider Part weighed in with KTM stops motorcycle production again, saying it doesn't have enough parts, so the bad news is confirmed by several sources now. The search for investors continues to fail, and on Wednesday evening, shortly before the shift was due to start, now CEO Gottfried Neumeister issued a video message to all PMG employees that all work must stop and all the production lines at KTM would be shut down completely. So far, KTM, or Piera Mobility Group should I really say, have completely failed to pay back the 600 million euros in debts agreed with the creditors when it restructured its business after nearly going bankrupt. That in itself would be cause for concern about the brand's future, but as you will hear, there are many more problems than that. After a highly publicised restart to production at its Matterhofen factory last month, it is shutting down the whole factory again. Initially, they said it would be until the end of July. The news came directly from CEO Gottfried Neumeister, and the employees received the news on Thursday morning via a video message. It read, "Due to serious supply chain problems, it's impossible to continue production as planned. The parts stocks were only enough for around 4,200 motorcycles to be built, and now there is a lack of essential components. Production in Matterhofen will therefore be suspended until the 27th of July. KTM has still yet to state what models those 4,200 motorcycles are too, but you will hear more about that later. According to the report, the problem is that KTM has not been able to source critical components for its motorcycles because when production stopped last year, no new parts orders were being made, and when production began again, the parts suppliers that KTM once worked with weren't really willing to trust that KTM could pay its bills. Rumour had it that many would only work on prepayment terms, and that hadn't been accounted for when the production restart was scheduled. Neumeister continued with the statement, "To avoid terminations, KTM is taking drastic measures, and from the 1st of May until the 1st of July, a new agreement provides payment for a 30-hour week for around just 3,000 employees. Wages will be adjusted accordingly, so on a positive note, that means more layoffs are unlikely, at least for now, but the time bomb is ticking. KTM can only hope that production will resume in July, and that is dependent on securing money to pay back creditors and finding enough money to persuade parts suppliers to resupply again. But KTM says it can't come up with the money to pay back those same suppliers, so it's likely to continue to be a major hurdle. You can see from the press cuttings that the headlines and the reality bear little resemblance to each other, and reaching the truth is harder than the rear suspension on a hardtail chop. So I decided to look at some of the contradictions in an effort to get to the bottom of what is really happening. You see, while the insolvency period passed, the restart was announced and the rescue package agreed, the money is still not in place. No investors have been found, and any talk of promissory notes seemed to have disappeared into the ether. The announcement said that the supply of several key components had failed. The employees were faced with empty parts shelves when the restart was initiated, and no replacement parts had been delivered. Then we got the announcement from CF Moto that KTM dealers would be no longer selling their bikes. So we can only surmise that the critical components that aren't available are engines, and that the relationship with CF Moto has now broken down. After all, why would CF Moto supply parts to a company that already owes them money, has told them they will only get 30% of the value of their shares, and can now offer no assurances that future bills will be paid? So what's really going on at KTM, you might ask? What is the truth behind all the headlines? To find that out, we need to look deeper. On the 17th of March, we had an article from Zeitung, and there were still many questions about the KTM comeback. In theory, KTM were to begin production on a single shift pattern funded by the second €50 million put into the administrator's account by Bajaj Autos. This would in theory be enough to start the production line again, and was to be held in addition to the $300 million needed to pay the existing shareholders the 30% agreed value of their long-held shares. But in the background, talks to find all the money for the insolvency agreement was not going well. Still, the only money in the administrator's account is the original $50 million put in by Bajaj, so there is still $250 million to find to keep the wolves at bay. This money should have been in the administrator's account by February the 25th, but now it seemed an extension until May the 23rd had been given to find the rest of the money. The official ramp-up phase of production was to begin, and KTM were emphatic, saying the assembly lines would be gradually ramped up. They said 4 production lines were to start on a single shift pattern, and that full capacity was expected to be achieved within the next 3 months, so by mid-June. They said the first stage would be marked by the delivery and inspection of goods, various pre-assemblies, and the start of sample and prototype construction. But remember, the R&D department hasn't been working since November. The first bikes, we were told, would then have been rolling off the production line around the 20th of March. Gottfried Neumeister, the now CEO of KTM AG and Piera Mobility, announced that in parallel with motorcycle production, the company would also be restarting work at KTM Components GmbH, where various parts are manufactured for the brand. In the course of insolvency proceedings, KTM laid off over 800 employees, and the remaining employees in the production department have been at home since mid-December, receiving the equivalent of what their salary would have been for a 30-hour week, all paid for by the Austrian government, while Stefan Piera was expanding his investment portfolio with the addition of Rosenbauer, an Austrian firefighting company, and refusing to put any of his own money into the pot to save or help restart work at KTM. Indian co-owners Bajaj have been the ones who financed the resumption of production, and in the process increased their shareholding to become the majority shareholder in the whole Piera Bajaj consortium, increasing their power within the KTM group. The restart of production in mid-March should have been an important step towards normality, but many questions still remain. The fact is, the first €50 million that co-owners Bajaj put in was to pay off existing shareholders, and is less than 17% of the total required by the administrators. And the second $50 million was to cover the cost of startup production, and that would only last until the end of March. After that, another €100 million were needed to continue production through April, and so far there had been no additional announcement of any funds. The Indian company had promised to provide this original $100 million, but still there was a black hole in the finances, and the administrators were seemingly not getting very far in finalising further investment. Immediately after the signing off of the restructuring plan for the KTM group, Pierre Mobility AG had known that fresh capital of around 800 million euros in total wouldn't be needed to finance the 30% quota for creditors and further production. But with Pierre Mobility Group entering into insolvency proceedings, things get even more complex financially. The investment process is running, no white flags have been raised yet, but this is all still very messy. This is the complex corporate web that's set up by Pierre and Bajaj, and you may ask why. But as the video goes on, you will maybe start to see through the smoke screen because there are countless announcements to go through. KTM had built up more than 2.5 billion euros in debt, and after the green light for the restructuring plan was approved, there has still been no clarity about who will put up the capital for the quota of the creditors. In theory, production was started again, and 2 TV teams and photographers documented the employees' commute trip in the early morning. Throughout the day, there were live feeds directly from the Mattergoffen plant, and it was obvious that KTM wanted things to be seen as to be as normal as possible. But real information was extremely economical, to say the least. They were saying very little to nothing, really. Even if many would like it to be, the green light for the restructuring plan was not the end of the story, especially since the question of the urgently needed investors was still unanswered. So far, Pierre Zockling & Co. have failed completely in their search for investment, despite any promises, and the previously announced letters of intent have not been converted into actual investment. The level of debt and the dubious figure of Pierre skulking in the background and refusing to put his hand in his own pocket creates a tension that will not change quickly. Then, on the 25th of March, 8 days after the supposed restart, we got the headline, KTM continues Mattergoffen torture. Why? Because despite the restart, everyone was still waiting in vain for clarity surrounding the so-called new investors. We were told production was now being ramped up, but will not go beyond a one-shift operation and will not be fully operational for at least 3 months. So full production would not resume until at least the middle of June. When asked how the ramp-up in production was working, KTM would still give no details. Shortly before the recovery plan agenda was agreed, there was apparently 7 potential investors involved in negotiations. How those conversations are developing can only be guessed at for now, but if the cash had materialised, you can guarantee Pierre & Co. would be shouting it from the rooftops. He may have successfully manipulated the administrators, but again I say the money is still not there. It was believed that the investor process would be completed between mid-March and the end of March. But what happens now that it's not? After all, the 50 million euros that co-owners Bajaj had made available for the resumption of production was only enough, according to the company's own calculations, to keep production going until the end of March. Then another 100 million euros were needed for April and each following month. Who pays for that? That's another question that there is also no answer to. According to Mattergoffen's mayor Daniel Lang, the highest level of confidentiality was guaranteed to interested investors, so we may never know, but the uncertainty about the search for investors leaves customers, Mattergoffen and the factory staff completely in the dark still. Everyone still has doubts as to whether KTM will be able to secure the jobs in Austria, and in a survey, only 38% of local residents and staff were convinced the jobs would be secure. 62% didn't think so. By the end of March, KTM still needed more money to secure operations in April and May. Bajaj had already put in 50 million euros to restart production in Mattergoffen, and in February, the total of 150 million euros were promised by the executive board, a third to restart production and the rest to continue operations in April and May. A total of €100 million was put in by Indian co-owner Bajaj, but the rest of the money is still not in place. Remember, on top of the money needed to run the factory, a total of €600 million must still be paid out to the creditors, so new investment had to be found. For production to be scaled up to full capacity, another €100 million was needed every month. Then we got the headline that KTM's parent company, KTM Mobility, had big trouble with a major bank. After the initial skepticism of the banks and the accusation of dodgy dealings at KTM Mobility Group, one bank began to kick up more fuss than the rest. They were owed over €64 million and it had still not materialised, and by the 31st of March KTM had run out of money again. Bajaj had made €50 million available for the start-up of production, but a further €100 million was still needed for production to continue, and it was still not clear whether either KTM or KTM Mobility had found any new financier for it, or raised any of the funds themselves. When would the next €50 million be found to continue ramping up production? Well, this question remained open, but it needed to be answered by KTM on April Fool's Day of all times. By this point, restructuring manager Peter Vogel was quoted as saying he was not convinced that the money would be available. Michael Seemeyer, managing director of the Pro-GE trade union in Upper Austria, said at the end of the month that the 30-hour-week agreement was over and that all workers should be back in the factory. But as you will hear as we go on, that might not be as accurate as I thought at the time, and further money needed to pay them was still not in place. Then we had the news from newly acquired Rosenbauer company about how KTM Mobility were taking control. The supervisory board was reassembled and Christian Reisinger, an ex-Lenzing board member, now had the chair. The Rabau consortium, led by Stefan Piera and Mark Matashif, now had full control. The supervisory board and the fire brigade company was restructured, and the original board of the fire brigade was cut out of the picture completely in February. Another extraordinary shareholders meeting was scheduled there, and at that, 3 candidates from the Rabau consortium joined the supervisory board, with Friedrich Rodner, chairman of Piera Industries, Gernot Hofer, chairman of the board of management of Invest AG, and Florian Hutter, managing director of Mark Matashit's Red Bull consortium, were now in control. At the same time, Jorge Asteloch, Bernhard Matzner, and Martin Paul Zentner quit the board completely, with no explanation. Motorcycle production at KTM in Mattergoffen had been running since the 17th of March, and it was announced then that it would continue. They had set up the next €50 million necessary for continuation, but again, there were no details. So when and where does the money flow? How much has been transferred? All month, these questions had been repeatedly asked of KTM, with increasing tension surrounding the new board. Then, on April Fool's Day, Bajaj were reported to have provided €150 million needed to continue production. But previously, the administrators had been working on €100 million per month costing to restart production, so things still don't add up. And now Peter Vogel himself was embroiled in the financial trickery. Vogel announced the money had been forwarded to KTM, and on April the 1st, KTM Mobility AG announced that KTM had an additional €50 million available to ensure production for April. But then, on the 2nd of April, we got the headline, KTM continues to play for time. One question remains. When will there be an answer to who joins KTM as a new investor? KTM Mobility then announced they had to raise another €600 million for procedural costs, but continued with the line about the confidentiality of the conversations. So the questions became, had $200 million already been paid into the administrator's account beyond the Bajaj investment? But no details were given. For those who have lost their jobs at KTM, the whole thing is a disaster anyway. There were many still looking for work. Michael Seameyer, Managing Director of ProGE, then said, "The longer it takes, the more insecure everything becomes, and the employees still have many questions." He continued, "We cannot make any recommendations. That is a very personal decision. But the lack of information also puts suppliers and customers in a torture chamber." From Seameyer's perspective, you need some predictability. It would therefore be good to ensure a relatively quick clarity on how to continue. But KTM have just said that patience is needed. Do customers and suppliers have any patience left? Then, in answer to a Freedom of Information request about the extraordinary general meeting, PMG announced that they will be creating a cash capital increase of €150 million by granting statutory subscription rights to the shareholders, and that shares for which subscription rights have been exercised may be taken up by the Pierre Bajaj company. So that means that unless existing PMG shareholders reached into their empty pockets, that Pierre Bajaj could sweep up a big pile of shares at below half price. The document continued by saying that any public offering of shares in Pierre Mobility AG in the context of the cash capital increase will be made exclusively by and on behalf of a capital market prospectus, to be prepared in accordance with the provisions of the prospectus regulation and approved by the FMA and subsequently published, and that an investment decision regarding any offered shares of Pierre Mobility AG should only be made on the basis of such a capital market prospectus. And if you can understand that corporate gobbledygook, you are a better man than me. So do let me know in the comments, and I will pin the best comment if anyone has one. Then the term capital increase in kind was introduced. That would be capitalisation of immovable property, securities and other tangible and intangible assets with economic value in the company. The key characteristic of this form of capital increase is the use of non-cash assets. So they are counting non-cash assets as part of the money needed to pay off investors, and I have no idea how that could work. How do you think the creditors will react when Pierre announces that we don't have any money for you, but you can have this €800 million we owe you in monopoly money if that's okay? This could be executed after the KTM Group's restructuring proceedings have been completed successfully, but they haven't. What it would mean is that only the main shareholder, Pierre Bajaj AG, will be admitted to subscribe to the non-cash capital increase. Pierre Bajaj AG intends to contribute loans made available to date for the ramp-up of production to the total value of €150 million as a contribution in kind. A further prospective loan of €50 million was also to be contributed as a contribution in kind. So when KTM are riddled with debts, the only solution found so far seems to be to lend them more money. That isn't my idea of a sound financial plan, and looks like it is just another way of funneling money out of the KTM coffers in the form of extra interest payments to the Pierre Bajaj Group. All the loans are to be contributed in kind, provide for a right of termination if the described non-cash capital increase is not carried out, at the issue price of €7.50 per share, or if the corresponding resolution of the general meeting is challenged in court by a shareholder. The funds for those loans was in theory provided to Pierre Bajaj AG by its long-standing partner and shareholder, Bajaj Autos. That means that the share capital of Pierre Mobility AG will be artificially increased by a figure of around €2.4 million. So you begin to see that the solution just looks like the original problem, really. Then we began to see some very significant trading on PMG stocks, which you can see in the charts here. We were then told production would no longer be continued in a part-time 30-hour week basis, and although for the time being a single shift operation would continue, they would be working to introduce 2 shifts, with further production lines being reactivated gradually. But again, no details of where the money was coming from. The Indian partner Bajaj was named as one of the potential investors. Then BMW and the Austrian company BLP Rotax, a subsidiary of the Canadian Bombarded Group, was mentioned. Stefan Zockling, head of the Supervisory Board of Pierer Mobility, was also talked about as an investor, but his money would come with strings attached. Since then, the suggestion has gone quiet. So again, we reach an impasse with no real information as to where the money is coming from. All in all, there have been many promises made. The shareholders agreed on the rescue package, but PMG are refusing to announce where and when the money will come. Zockling seems to be doing his best to keep Pierer's dirty fingers out of the negotiations, but Pierer is still pulling the strings behind the scenes. We're still bombarded with a marketing blitz on the new 390 Adventure and now a future 690 Rally, and we are constantly told not to worry, everything is okay. The motorcycle press in general talk of everything being fine, and that all the exciting new 2025 range will be available soon. But we are already almost in May, and the dealers who haven't already ditched the brand have no idea when the 2025 stock will be available. To make it worse, they still have a massive backlog of stock sat in warehouses and dealers that will simply not disappear. Dumping that stock onto the market at rock bottom prices may raise money, but it would devalue the brand overall. Buyers are still wary, to say the least. There has been no talk of the future of the various race teams under the KTM, Husqvarna and Gas names, and remember, even the administrators stressed the importance of racing as the only real chance of future marketing success. The MotoGP team continues to struggle, and the Gas and Husky Rally teams have all been disbanded. The sponsorship of the Super Enduro World Championship has been dropped, and now much is being left in the hands of successful privateers to try and elevate the brand's status again. We have a saying, all talk and no action, and that appears to be the state of play, still. One of the things being talked about is the fact that so far all the funding has come from Bajaj, and that is only in loans. So a company crippled by debt before this happened is yet again being funded by more debt. The shareholders have still not been paid, and no names at all have been confirmed as the source of any real money. Pierer may have stepped away from the camera, but he is still the one pulling the strings, and he is the one who is set to make the most out of the mess along with the Bajaj Group. The Indians are sat there quietly counting shares and are now in many ways the ones in control. They are the ones making the bulk of the new KTM stock, and the details of what is being made in Austria is still not being released anywhere. Dealers are being pushed to take on new stock they haven't even seen, while they are still stuck with piles of 2024 bikes they are struggling to sell. Pierre is already causing problems at his new investments, and it appears no one is able to stop his ever-expanding greed. However, his actions have triggered investigations by the banks, and if they find evidence of his wrongdoings, they will be standing in the courts trying to force him to take responsibility. But the courts, administrators and the Austrian government seem to be blind to his financial jiggery-pokery. Or maybe they just don't care beyond their own vested interest. So, after yet another month of glorified exaggerated news stories, we have nothing in the form of concrete evidence that the administrator's rescue plan is being adhered to. In addition, another 150 million euros in debts to the Bajaj Group have now been racked up to restart production of something, but we don't know what. And now the money has been used up and we have nothing more in the pipeline. None of the 600 million needed to pay creditors has been detailed, despite passing the date when it should have all been in place, and the 600 million minimum in shortfall is nowhere to be seen. Bajaj have obviously said no more. Stefan Zockling's talk of further investment has not materialised, and BMW and BRP Rotax are running for the hills. Now, production stopped completely again. Staff are back at home being paid a pittance with their careers and future in question, and the relationship with CF Moto has failed. Parts suppliers are demanding business will only happen on prepayment terms, and Stefan Piera is nowhere to be seen. So, is this the end for KTM? Honestly, I see no way out now. I really do think the writing is on the wall and the breakup of the company is now the only thing on the cards. And yes, it makes me sad that we will lose at least one iconic brand and maybe Husqvarna and GasGas too. And it leaves me angry that Stefan Piera and the PMG board are simply being allowed to walk away from all of this after fleecing the company for years. Tell me below in the comments what you really think will happen. I've heard many say that KTM are too big to fail, but they said that about the Lehman Brothers Bank too, and it still happened. Thanks as always to everyone, but especially the BAREBONESMC family who support me with their donations. Without them, none of this would be possible. Try and remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. And sharing the video anywhere you think people will be interested helps us a lot too, now the YouTube algorithm has thrown us in the bin again. If you would like to help us to stay truly independent, you can make a one-off donation or join our group of monthly subscribers on the Ko-fi link on screen. Monthly subscribers get access to a private group where I share the videos I can't screen on YouTube, and people who make a one-off donation will get exactly the same access as the monthly subscribers. It just resets after 30 days. That means for a minimum donation of just £1, you get to see if you think the extra content is worth more than £1 a month. And if you do, you choose the amount you can afford to chip in each month. Remember, we make the best biker t-shirts too. With original designs throughout, we have hundreds of the best biker t-shirts anywhere. Take a look around the shop to see what's on offer. We have quality t-shirts, graphic print t-shirts and neck gaiters all available worldwide. Whatever you ride, there is something for everyone. And if you can't find what you want, just drop me a line. Custom work is not a problem. Links to the main website and the Redbubble shop are in the description. Thanks as always to all the supporters for your help keeping the channel going. You are BAREBONESMC. Have a great week, and always remember, keep your spanners close and your keys even closer. Ride free, everyone!